real conversations, and some hard truths. Gangs, drugs, and guns. Giving a voice to those willing to sacrifice. We have stories that need to be told. We have lessons that need to be taught. Protect and serve. Welcome to The Quiet Professional.
So hi everyone, and welcome back with you. Coming at you with another episode in our series about China, as well as our co-host for this series, Calvin Krusty, senior partner and consultant with the Critical Risk team. So welcome, Calvin.
Thank you very much. Looking forward to the discussion today with Nick.
We are continuing our discussion with experts on issues such as the Chinese Communist Party, organized crime, and information and hybrid warfare. Because of the growing influence on our nation from both outside actors and within, Calvin and I have put together this series of podcasts on these issues and more. And before I introduce our guest, I'm just going to clarify that when talking about China, we're talking about the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, and their various arms of influence and coercion. This is distinct from the good people of China, the majority of whom are good global citizens and have contributed to the advancement and prosperity of many nations. So with that, our guest today is Nick McKenzie. Nick is an investigative journalist with the Age news agency in Australia. Nick has twice been named the Perkin Australian Journalist of the Year. This award is given as one of Australia's preeminent prizes for journalism. Also, he's a winner of 10 Walkley Awards, hopefully I'm saying that right, which are awarded for excellence in journalism and to the best people in their craft. Nick investigates politics, business, foreign affairs, human rights, and criminal justice. So welcome, Nick.
Great to be here.
So, thanks for calling in from literally halfway around the world. You're technically in the future, so you have more insight to anything that's going on than us. But maybe we'll just start with a little bit of background on you before we get into what's been going on and current events. But if you could kind of tell us about yourself and who you are, where you come from, and then we'll get into more in-depth stuff.
Sure, yeah. I'm a journalist of 20 years. I've worked in Australia and travelled around the world with my job, but in that 20 years, I've focused basically the whole time on investigative journalism. So deep dives, looking at a whole range of different issues, but often coming back to some core issues: organised crime, corruption in politics, corruption in sport, corruption in business, and more recently looking at the overlap between organised crime, Chinese Communist Party interference, foreign interference in Australia. Australia was really a canary in the coal mine when it came to the topic of CCP interference. We were the first country to really take notice of it a couple of years ago and introduce a program of significant legal reform. And that really came about due to the work of journalists across the nation, including myself, a real case of investigative journalism working to shine a light on something that was actually hiding in plain sight, but no one was doing a great deal about it till it hit the press. So I've applied my craft to a whole range of different topics in the same sort of way, which is once I find something that needs investigating, we ask ourselves the question: is it in the public interest? Does the public have a right to know? Is there a powerful or vested interest trying to cover something up, which needs to be held to account? And if the answer to those things is yes, then we start digging like mad, a bit like a police officer or an investigator. We go down every borough we can find. We speak to as many people as we can. We use FOI, freedom of information laws, to find documents. We get leaks, and we try to establish facts that certain people want hidden and broadcast them.
So just when you were talking about the investigative journalism and maybe the difference between investigative journalism and reporting, what would you consider investigative journalism to be? So is that just like the more of the deep dive, the lengthier investigations?
Listen, I don't distinguish between the two. All journalism should be some sort of basic investigation. I mean, there's all sorts of, there's superficial journalism, which may not require a great deal of digging. Someone goes to a press conference and that's about it. But decent journalism requires a level of fact-finding and testing information. And investigative journalism is simply journalism that requires a lot of that. And I think one thing that maybe helps people understand just how deep we do dive and how thorough we can be as investigative journalists. In Australia, we have a really pernicious defamation regime. It's very easy to be sued. Anyone can issue a lawsuit against the journalist for basically nothing, a very cheap cost. And it's very hard for a journalist, due to our defamation laws, to defend themselves for a whole range of reasons. Sydney, New South Wales has been called by the New York Times the defamation capital of the world. So when we do journalism, or when I do journalism, I'm looking to gather information, not just that I could believe to be true and I believe needs to be published or broadcast, but which I could prove in a civil court of law to the standard of the balance of probabilities. And if you think about that, that can be quite a difficult task when you're investigating organised crime or corruption or espionage. And espionage obviously takes place in the dark. Very, very hard to get firm proof of it. If you were to accuse somebody, as I have, of espionage, extremely difficult to prove that in a court. But that's the task that is ahead of people like myself, and that's the task that we tackle by digging, finding people who'll come to court, finding information that we can rely on in court, and then using that information to publish, hoping we never get to court, but knowing if we do, we've got a chance of defending ourselves.
So with that, is there any sort of oversight body for you, or is it literally just like an editor says, this sounds safe, like it's been investigated enough, we can go ahead and print it?
Oh, there's a really significant set of professional practices we undertake as journalists. There's a whole rigour in terms of the way that my organisation, you mentioned I work at The Age, that's one of a number of newspapers owned by my company, Nine. We run the television network in Australia. There's digital outlets. We're the biggest media company in the country, and there's hundreds of journalists across the country. There's editors and a whole process of rigor and fact checking. On top of that, we have our code of ethics as journalists, which guide us in terms of integrity and honesty and proper practice. And of course, there's the public. People won't like or journalism. They won't read it. They won't buy the product. They won't consume it if they fail to trust it. The ultimate accountability, I think, is held by our audience. People don't like bad journalism. They like good journalism. I think what we see now in the world is people loving podcasts and all different sorts of new media that is giving old-fashioned journalism in a new way. But at the core of that is good storytelling, good digging, interesting tales and facts that people deserve to know that are being covered up. And there's a real hunger for that.
Well, definitely evidenced by your investigation to Crown Resorts. Like, I was reading through that whole thing, and I mean, it's so concise and to the point, but so much information in there. And I actually sent it to a bunch of coworkers. They were getting right into it. They loved it. But it overlaps a lot with the stuff going on in Canada. And maybe just before we do get into that, though, on kind of the topics we were just on, have you ever had, so I've read that you've had some sort of maybe threats against you. You've been sued. Have you ever had any political pressure? Do politicians ever really go after journalists?
Absolutely. I mean, they're amongst the class of people that I guess that we go after as reporters, because it's our job to hold politicians to account. But the only people who perhaps have thinner skins than journalists, we never like to be held to account ourselves, despite saying otherwise, is politicians. They hate being scrutinised.
Yeah.
And they come after us in all different sorts of ways. I've been attacked from the floor of Parliament under parliamentary privilege, where basically been smeared and slandered by politicians I've investigated. I've been sued by politicians. You have ongoing battles with politicians because they have very long memories and they're good haters sometimes. That's just the hazard of the job. That's the core thing that we do as reporters, of course, is to scrutinise politics. That's where so much power resides.
Yeah.
And I mean, there is, if you could go after organised crime as well, it's pretty. I mean, I often say I don't live in Russia or China. I can't be jailed for my craft, and I'm not going to end up floating in the river or poisoned. But you still cop some nasty threats. I've had to move out of my house because someone I was relying on for information was murdered. We have very serious and violent Italian organised crime mafia organisations in the country. I've investigated, and certainly cop threats from those sorts of people. I have cameras outside my house, and I'm pretty surveillance conscious. But all that said, it's a really good place to do journalism because we live in a pretty safe country with systems of accountability and oversight, which are pretty good compared to other places.
Yeah, I always think about that. Like when I deal with people on the street, I work in our gang unit, and just even with some of the people we deal with, we end up having to tell a lot of them. It's like, we're not bodyguards. Like, I'm not there 24/7. So you got to be more vigilant and take your own safety into account, like what that's going to look like. Right. So I don't envy the task that you have. So maybe kind of getting into,
on that point, you remind me, obviously get to know lots and lots of police as an investigative reporter, and they become some of your best sources, and they become your good friends. A good organised crime senior detective I've known for 20 years, but after getting a threat from a pretty serious gangster in Melbourne, I spoke to him, what should I do? And he said, Nick, I'm in a gang of 13,000 people, being the Victoria Police Force, and you're in a gang of one. And it was a bit of a way of saying, well, of him politely and having a bit of a joke, but to say you're on your own. Good luck to you. And it was it happened years ago. It still rings in my head.
Yeah, it most definitely. I mean, when you're police or in some sort of intelligence body, there's other people that work with you, and I guess if something happens to you, like you said, there's 1,000 people looking into that what happened. Whereas if something happens to you or a journalist, like what's really going to be the recourse, and who's looking into that? So you're bang on that point. So kind of getting into the history of the CCP in Australia and some of the criminal organizations operating there. I've been doing a whole bunch of reading kind of leading up to doing these podcasts with yourself and Sam Cooper, and looking at some of the history, at least in Canada. I can see a lot of stuff kind of really kicked off in the 1970s. And I'm just wondering, like on your end, a lot of your reporting that I was able to find is more recent, but do you have any kind of historical perspective on like when this started or when it really kicked into gear for Australia, at least for the influence part?
I mean, the overlap between organised crime and foreign interference or influence is murky and not well understood. There's very little scholarship about it, and at the moment, as far as I know, it's really a topic of speculation and some good reporting, which paints often a good anecdotal or case study picture. But no one can clearly point to a big body of evidence to say that the CCP's overseas influence arm, which is certainly very active in places like Australia and Canada, I suspect, is in a systematic and deliberate way working with organised crime to achieve its aims. But what we do see is an overlap between the influence organisations and sometimes the espionage organisations and the business community, the Chinese business community, and organised criminals, which leads to the question, well, how deliberate is this overlap? Is it simply the confluence of similar interests? So often those in organised crime are also business people. They're chasing money, and the CCP can be a very good ally when you're trying to make money through different means. Then you have organised crime figures carrying out the work of the CCP to help them make a buck. But is the CCP or parts of the CCP deliberately engaging with organised crime as an organised crime strategy policy? And I don't know. I suspect it is happening, but it's a really, really fascinating question, and one that I think we'll learn more about in the coming years. In terms of foreign interference influence, it's been happening in Australia at least since the 90s in a way that was being reported and understood. but really it took off as a significant issue. It was less of an issue when the CCP was less of a concern and had less ambitions for great global power, and before the great battle with the US really took off. So while the CCP's influence games were happening in Australia, I think people were less concerned about them. But in around 2015, 2016, 2017 in Australia, it became a massive political issue. And largely because there were really major scandals involving politicians taking donations from Chinese Australian business people who had significant ties to United Front bodies. These are Chinese government CCP entities whose task it is to win influence, win friends, and shape politics in foreign countries. And not only were these politicians taking donations from these business people in these United Front groups, but they were sometimes actually pushing the policy interests or the speaking points of the CCP in Australia. So you had a payment, donations, money, and a politician in one case standing up in public and parroting some of the CCP's foreign policy talking points, or word for word. And it looked like the CCP, through its proxies in Australia, was actually buying influence. Now, that was exposed, and there was an uproar, and we had new laws introduced in Australia, which, whether they worked well is an open question, but ultimately tried to cast a big net of accountability and transparency over these sorts of influence organisations, United Front organisations, and tried to ensure there was things like better accountability around political donations.
Go ahead, Calvin.
Thanks, Nathan. Nick, Calvin here. I just wonder if you can expand on what you were talking about as it related to illicit finance, foreign interference, and political corruption, and just maybe expand on that if you could, just to give the listeners some more insight in terms of what you're seeing in Australia relative to illicit activities of these groups, in terms of other criminal activity that you're seeing outside that high level illicit finance, political corruption. Are you seeing activities? Because I think you were also reporting on some of the casino issues, money laundering issues, and I don't know what other issues you were seeing, but in terms of other activities, because I don't know if we understand the full interconnectivity of the illicit activities, because you often hear from so-called experts. They go, hey, here's this, they're money laundering guys. And then other experts go, hey, here's this corruption. But what I think is often missed is the interconnectivity. And I'd be really interested, from an Australian perspective, if you could kind of expand on terms of the interconnectivity of the illicit activities, from an Australian perspective.
Yeah, most certainly. And I think I often find when describing these sorts of things, case studies are terrific because they bring things, they help us paint the picture. So let me tell you, or give you a great case study in point. And I think it's a good anecdote as to what the overlap between Chinese or CCP influence, interference, and organised crime and donations look like. So in the early to mid 2000s, 2007, 8, a guy called Tom Zhao, or he was known in Australia as Mr. Chinatown, arrives in Melbourne. And this guy has many millions of dollars. He becomes a junket for the biggest casino in town in Melbourne, Crown Casino, a major listed company, and one of the biggest sort of tourist attractions in Melbourne, Australia. As a junket, Mr. Chinatown's job is to bring high wealth individuals from China, largely or often in breach of Chinese capital flight laws, into Australia and to arrange their massive gambling. We're talking about whales gambling, sometimes hundreds of millions, sometimes billions of dollars every year or two. Really significant high wealth individuals from China. Now, Mr. Chinatown had a very interesting backstory. He was actually a fugitive. He had committed a series of significant organised crimes in China, had fled China, was the subject of a red notice via Interpol, had somehow passed through Australian border controls, set up a very significant business in Australia that was effectively an organised crime figure. Now, what was he doing in Australia, in addition to his casino work? So that casino work was bringing in a lot of money for him. He was bringing in a lot of people, influential, powerful people from China. And one of his connections was a relative of the Chinese president. But at the same time, he was liaising with serious organised crime in Australia, largely to money launder. There's allegations of other significant, even drug trafficking, that sort of behaviour. He was running with serious organised crime, with dirty drug money, and washing that through the casino at the same time, helping a whole range of people from China get into the country, including people with links to espionage or United Front work. So he had this business interest, this crime interest, and suddenly this CCP interest. And he was also giving political donations locally. And what we saw was a guy who, well, the Chinese government wants him. He's wanted for serious crimes in China, yet for some reason in Melbourne, Australia, he was suddenly the head of a significant United Front group that was supported by the local Chinese consulate. So it was as if the Chinese government must have known he was an organised crime figure, yet turned a blind eye because he was helping the CCP in its United Front activities in Melbourne. He was funding them. He was running these influence groups. He was helping people come into the country to aid the CCP's interests. And as part of that influence gathering, he was giving donations to local politicians, including our Premier of the state. We exposed him, and he was actually in I think Vanuatu, trying to set up a new casino. He was arrested there by the local authorities, and the Chinese government nabbed him there. I suspect because he was the subject of so much bad publicity. He was whacked on a plane back to China, and we've never heard from him since. He's languishing somewhere in a jail cell, I suspect. But a classic example of organised crime, influence, big money, CCP, United Front work, local donations, political donations, and all happening in relative plain sight. And frankly, investigating him, there were some more difficult aspects to it. But a great deal of it was simply looking at Chinese language documents and doing some basic internet sleuthing to pull the pieces together. To me, it remains one of the most colourful, crazy stories, because this guy, despite his significant criminal past, he had one of the wealthiest, most expensive houses in the most expensive suburb, and was really saying to the world, I'm here, I'm powerful, and no one's doing anything about it. And it was as if the systems of state in Australia simply failed to understand the danger of a guy like this. And the CCP was saying, well, you Ripper, we can put people like this into places like Australia, and no one's going to do much about it.
Yeah, you know what? That kind of reminds me of like a couple scenarios where we've dealt with people, like at one of our higher end hotels, some of the casinos, things that I never would have looked at before, never would have looked at twice before, is like people bringing in bags of money. So we've been told, by management at one of the hotels, like, hey, this guy always comes in, he's rolling in his fancy car, comes in with all the girls, he's carrying a couple bags, and they're literally filled with cash. And as like a police officer at ground level, it's like, well, what do I do with that? Like, a constable or whatever it might be at ground level, I'm going to take on the CCP or whatever other organization, whether it's just a giant criminal organization, But in reading a lot of the stuff that you've put out, that Sam's put out, and then in a few other people we've talked to, it's really, I would say, helped police on those frontline levels, even other people that I work with that have read your material, read some of the books that are out there. It's really opened a lot of eyes to that stuff. And then they start asking more questions, right? Start stopping people and saying like, hey, why do you have this hockey bag full of cash? It's kind of unusual. At least putting some people on notice that things are getting done. So, and your work too, one of the things that we always joke about in our field is just how well the criminal element can work together. So you see the CCP with the Triads, and then working with like junket operators and people further down the line. get a lot, like it's very hard to get a lot of that cooperation and sharing of intel and knowledge among governments and their law enforcement agencies. Even among law enforcement agencies, we see a lot of difficulty in the sharing of information. So a lot of things get missed. People are, the bad guys, for lack of a better term, can move very easily, but police can't. Like, jurisdiction comes into issue. Now you have people arguing, but I think a lot of what you did with your investigating, it's helped tremendously in the policing world, especially in Australia. It's put a lot of people on notice, but work like yours and then what other people have done in Canada or US has opened eyes over here too. So that's one of the things I always found very fascinating about the criminal element is just, if they want to get something done, they can work very well together and make it happen. Whereas steering a giant government or like the RCMP or somebody to turn a certain direction, it's years of policy and budgets and different things.
It's been a major issue in Australia. I mean, we've got a federalised system. The state police forces often don't talk to each other. But some of the guys, investigators who found or stumbled across this problem first up were, and it makes a lot of sense, they were the Asian organised crime or money laundering organised crime detectives, and they found these huge money trails, these bags of cash, as you described, literally being walked in, and sometimes in grocery bags into casinos. And they do a bit more digging, and they say, well, the money's come from the drug trade, but it also seems like it's linked to a United Front group or someone in a CCP United Front group, and they paint this picture. But at the end of the day, they go to their bosses, and the bosses say, well, give us a drug charge or a money laundering charge. I'm not interested in some interesting, curious overlap between the CCP and its influence activities. Send that off to the intelligence agencies, and now the intel agencies are a void in which information goes in and never comes out. And we very rarely hear what's happening. And a huge shift has been happening in Australia, where in the past, where there's been CCP influence or espionage type activities, the target will be watched, looked at, and then quietly reported. There's a lot of pressure now on law enforcement and our intel agencies to actually charge some of these entities with breaking Australian laws. That's still not happening in great numbers, but there's certainly pressure. But ultimately, there was lots of these cases being found by pretty clever cops, and it was just falling through the cracks, which is where journalism jumps in and says, well, can we at least put it in the public domain and cause a bit of a debate about it? But that said, the debate happens for 5 minutes. There might be some legislative change, but the law is only as good as the person who's enforcing it. And still there's a lot more that needs to be done, and the battle it goes on, and we must remain ever vigilant. And as you say, organised crime can work fluidly across borders. You've got organised criminal groups in outlaw motorcycle gangs working with Chinese Communist Party linked triads, working with Italian organised crime, all moving around the world using the latest digital encrypted applications, etc. Bitcoin, and then we've got these clunky state police organisations who still sometimes don't talk to each other, and when they do this, it's often not sharing as they should, and the laws are little equipped, and to actually enforce organised crime costs a lot of money. It's an organised crime job with phone taps and forensic analysis. This costs a crap load, and you're going to have policing bosses going, well, why spend that? Why spend the dollars?
Yeah, I don't think they really see the downstream effects of a lot of it. So they would rather get the immediate kilo in a locker, right? You see the product right there. You get the gun right away. But to try and go after the head of a group, or at least it's like some higher ups, and see that can make like an actual dent, or at the very least in a massive organization, right? Like it could stop a few truckloads of stuff coming in, or boatloads of things coming in for a week. It's not, I guess, as media friendly, or at least it's not something we could put like on the front page news right away. So maybe that's why they're not so inclined to go after it.
Yeah. It's there's nothing the old school policing bosses like than a bag of dope on a table at a press conference. But really, when we ask ourselves, what is the impact of this policing, and what are we actually trying to stop or deter? And if you try to stop foreign interference and influence. How do we measure that? Is it in arrests of people breaking the law? And do we need to see some more people going to jail? Ultimately, it comes down to accountability. There's got to be far more of it, and it's still this very difficult area to investigate for law enforcement. It's largely not done that well, and so much of it occurs to this day. I mean, that said, our intel agencies, I think, are probably doing a much better job than they were, and there's a lot. The duck's legs are paddling beneath the pond surface. We're just not seeing it out in the public. But so much of this stuff, I think, should be in the public domain if this is happening. And this is a big tension in Australia. We have our government entities and saying we don't want to annoy the CCP. We don't want to upset our trade relationship and our diplomatic relationship any more than we have already. So let's just keep this stuff. Let's handle it in a way that causes fewer dramas by keeping it secret. And to that, journalists and the public say, no, we demand to know if an overseas country is interfering in our affairs. Let's put it out. Let's get some sunlight there, and let's see it, and we can deal with the problem and know it's happening. We want to see political donations when they flow. We want to see money laundering when it's going for our big casinos. Let's talk about it. And there has been some of that.
Yeah.
Nick, I have a couple questions, and it's probably just more expanding on something that you touched on. Be really interested. I know from my international policing perspective, working with the Australians over the course of over a decade, up until 2018, roughly, I saw a significant acceleration in terms of their impact globally. Like they were, like many police forces, well respected. But I think they went from being well respected to being exceptionally respected over that last decade in terms of their punching far above their weight, particularly in this global fight. And I just wondered, from a journalistic perspective, and coming from Australia, did you see the same thing that we saw from a policing perspective in terms of the law enforcement and intelligence agencies really stepping up to the plate?
I mean, there's no doubt that we have, for a relatively small country, a significant ability to work internationally. One thing the Australian Federal Police has done really well is to have liaison posts all over the world. One of the first Western policing forces to actually have a memorandum of understanding with Chinese policing authorities, which has paid huge dividends in terms of intel sharing around the drug trade, but also leads to certain other problems because the CCP security agencies only share what they wish to share, and but that's a different issue. But largely said, Australia, one of the great things that we have is the Five Eyes policing and intel network. So Five Eyes being more famous for the intel side of things, but now we have the Five Eyes cooperation amongst policing agencies as well, and sharing the intel with Canada, with New Zealand, with Britain, US, UK, and leveraging these international partnerships to get as much bang for your buck, knowing that police forces all over the world are resource stretched. And the only way we can fight organised crime is to work across borders. On paper, it looks great. Sometimes it pays tremendous dividends. We recently had we had a number of major arrests of international fugitives, significant global organised crime bosses that Australia has picked up because of its relationships with authorities overseas. Organised crime, of course, is truly global. So if you're not working not only with your Five Eyes partners, but with the countries where there's a lot of Aussie gangsters at the moment hold up in Turkey, and there's a lot of work behind the scenes where the Aussies are trying to get the Turks on side and build these strong relationships between police to police agencies. That's how work and success occurs, through those personal relationships. If you're not in that game, then you're not fighting organised crime. But still, I think it is. We're only getting a small percentage of the organised crime, and the amount of significant money laundering, drug trafficking, foreign influence that's not going detected is tremendous. And what do you do when I think someone told me there was 300,000, the AFP, our federal policing agency, 300,000 precursor chemical companies in China that are pumping out precursor chemicals across the world, which is having untold impact on the drug trade. And the CCP is doing very little about it. Now, why? Is it because they want to stoke unrest in Australia and elsewhere by being quite happy to see organised crime and drug trafficking prosper? All those international relationships that Australia has, only go so far to stop problems such as that. Drug money laundering, so much of it now goes through the CCP endorsed financial networks in China.
Mm-hmm.
How do we deal with these financial flows if the Chinese government is not assisting as it should? So that's a major challenge for authorities here.
And similar issues in Canada, and it's I find it surprising. Well, we do see some coverage in the news. It's usually with a handful of journalists, but similar to Australia, and this is all open source material. But one individual moving 92 metric tons of precursors, all of them looking congruent with the use of illicit manufacturing of drugs. And it's kind of a one headline story and it's buried. And when you think about the possible implications in terms of the social impact, health impact, and criminal impact, and possibly national security impact of that, and that's just one person, I'm shocked that it's not covered more. On that note, I'd be interested in terms of the experience and your perspective right now, currently, with the CPP, these networks, or CCP and the networks, and the fentanyl issues. If you're seeing any, connections relative to those networks and fentanyl.
Well, we are, of course. We're often a little bit behind the US, but obviously it's been a massive problem in the United States. But Australia has not all sorts of illicit drug types are being sourced largely from southern China. Our Commissioner of the Federal Police, Reece Kershaw, a few months ago gave a significant talk. It was actually the Five Eyes policing network met in Sydney, and he addressed them. And he called out. Now, he didn't name China, but it was very clear he was talking about states that were turning a blind eye to this precursor trade, leading to drugs flooding the market. So it's a massive issue. But how do we stop it? I mean, all we can do, I think, initially is talk about it. Yet it remains a very unspoken about topic. And the question that I ask myself is why is that? I mean, in Australia we have a permissive drug culture. I think lots of people don't really get too energized when they see the headlines about big drug seizures. Maybe police have really dropped the ball in selling the story about how they do their work and why it matters and why we should care and the sort of flow-on effects from drug importation and corruption, etc. But there's a public indifference, and with that comes political indifference, and therefore the whole issue just bumbles away, and no one's doing enough about it. Yeah, absolutely, we're seeing this huge. I think actually the precursor drug flows from southern China and elsewhere in China are so significant now. We're just overwhelmed in Australia. There's very little we can do about it. But there's always more we can do about it. And even our chief commissioner actually saying, without naming the CCP, but saying there is a state behind this that could be doing more, and its failure to regulate the precursor chemical industry is having this downstream effect in places like Australia and elsewhere. Its failure to regulate the financial flow industry is having this downstream money laundering impact in places like Australia, and we've got to call out these state actors that are doing this, because it's wreaking havoc here. That was a massive step for a police commissioner to do, and a welcome step.
So why do you think, though, in light of this fact, in terms of the toll, in terms of deaths of fentanyl, why do you think that they didn't go farther and name the state when it's essentially, like, say, for example, in Canada, it's well articulated and stated by our intelligence agency that the number one threat to Western democracies is the Chinese government currently. Australia has probably been a leader in that. And I'm just curious, in terms of what your analysis or perspective would be, why do you think the commissioner of the AFP wouldn't take that extra step and align himself publicly with the intelligence agencies and call it out?
Well, in fact, he did align himself with our intelligence agencies because they're not naming China.
Oh,
So it's interesting. In Australia, while we've had a huge public debate, and at times certain politicians have called it out, we have not gone the way of the US and to a lesser extent the UK in calling out the CCP for these sorts of issues. Why? Well, we're not the big dog like the US. We don't have the. I mean, this is what I disagree. I think we should, but the naysayers would say we simply don't have the ability to absorb the diplomatic and trade blowback that the US has, and which would allow us then to call out the CCP and not worry about the blowback. Ultimately, it's a battle behind the scenes here. We have our Department of Foreign Affairs, which is always saying, let's not name China, let's not piss off the CCP, we've just have a thawing of relations between our new Labor federal government and the CCP after disastrous relationships in the years previous, because we had started to take on the CCP with our new foreign interference laws. So once again, we're the turtle's been putting its head back into the shell and saying let's not annoy the CCP. And it's frustrating because there's this discussion happening publicly, and everyone knows China's at the middle of it, and no one's actually saying the word China.
it's interesting, from a Canadian perspective on this, for Canadian listeners, because I must say, hearing that, I'm a bit surprised, because I've seen the AFP and the Australian Intelligence Agency step, punch above their weight, for lack of a better term. But here in Canada, we've been fortunate, probably, where our intelligence agency, kudos to them, CSIS, and recently our military have spoken about being currently entangled in terms of some major national security issues with China, and talking that we're actually engaged in a hybrid warfare situation currently, which I thought were big, huge statements for them to make. And hearing from the Australian perspective, it actually, is somewhat comforting to see some of our leadership step forward in that regard. And hopefully someday the policing community will step forward. But there is that awkward political, diplomatic quagmire that I think many of the people are caught in terms of speaking about it. But I think the role that journalism plays in this is probably a primary role in terms of spotlighting the issues for the public currently. But I think, Nathan, you may have a question or comment.
I was just going to kind of add on to what you're saying, where, it's getting out there, but when it's having the politicians really trust the intelligence and the policing communities when they do say something, but then you find they kind of want to walk a certain line, they want to fence it, they don't want to take a position, at least not a hard position on a lot of things. And that makes it hard on the policing side, because you're limited in what you can put out there, especially when it's a middle of an investigation, right? So that's why, like you're saying, I think the journalism is a huge part of this, a huge part of the solution. So we need people digging into it from all sides, because what one person might not be able to say, another person can, if the politicians aren't going to say it, or at least pick a side. Because even in Canada, at least, we've seen with our current administration that they cozied up in a way, sometimes saying things like they admire the CCP to some degree. So it's makes you wonder, we're where people lie.
Yeah, it's one of the things that happens. It's rare that it happens, but it does happen, is when there is a confluence of, you get a bunch of detectives who see a concerning issue like this, and they actually sort of break ranks and go behind their bosses' backs, and they work with journalists to get this stuff out, because they know that it should be in the public domain. And that's the way too often things are done in Australia, because we have our politicians who are too politically cautious to call out the CCP. And that's why we need the press. That's why we need investigative journalism, because otherwise these sorts of issues are going to remain buried.
I was just going to say, I think that's what you see with the current Indo-Pacific policy from Australia, and they're making a few different pacts with other Asian countries, a few other people in the region, whether it's Japan was one of them, but Canada's kind of getting on board with that. If you read their newest policy, it's talking a lot about partnerships in other areas. It almost seems like a slow phase out of China, or at least a reliance on China, which Canada isn't really. I think they're something like 4%. I might be getting this totally wrong, but I think they're a smaller trading partner than we think they are. So I think you see that in current Indo-Pacific policy from Australia, at least, changing up partnerships, and you see it with like the implementing of some of the laws, like you were mentioning there at the beginning, Nick. Was it 2017, 2018, some significant changes coming in, and now they're going after these major heads of organizations, right? Like the recent arrest of Mr. C. What's his name here? C. Shai Law, if I'm saying that right. And what I found interesting about that is, from the reading I've been doing, that I guess they wanted to arrest him not in Canada, so they tried to get him when he landed somewhere else. So that says quite a bit about us, when, whether people trust Canada, the security that we have here. So
it's a fascinating question as to why they didn't wait for him to get to Canada. I suspect because I think he's got citizenship there, and it would have been a real battle to perhaps extradite him. I'm not sure. But yeah, it's a really great story. That story of he's known as Brother 3, but he's been dubbed the El Chapo of Asia, the biggest drug trafficker in the region, who was responsible for perhaps more, and people say up to 70% of all narcotics imported into Australia over the last 20 years, which is a huge amount. We're talking about multi-billions of dollars worth of the drug trade. The really interesting thing about his organisation, it's known as the Company, or the Grandfather Syndicate, and it's, according to some police sources, it's this sort of multinational network of formerly warring triad organisations who have terrific contacts in the governments in China and Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, really working much like a multinational company. And how is this entity getting away with it? How deep do their ties go in, say, the Cambodian government or the militaries in various Southeast Asian nations? And how is this guy, Brother 3, as they called him, able to get away with his activities for such a long time? He was effectively holed up in Taiwan at the end, with significant connections to Taiwanese officials. There were some phone taps of this guy where he basically said, I own Macau. The officials in Macau are on my payroll. But he's been arrested. He's in Australia after many years on the run.
Yeah.
And he's going to face justice in a local court here, which is an extraordinary thing.
Yeah.
To your point, both Nick and Nathan, just regarding why he wasn't arrested in Canada, I can safely say, as Nick's somewhat familiar with my familiarity and relationships with the Australian police, and also with the American authorities, having worked with them for a decade plus on these type of issues, is, I think, sadly, from a Canadian policing perspective and a Canadian national perspective, there's just a sad awareness amongst our policing partners globally that the legal framework that we're working in, while the police may be doing, exceptional work, the tools that we have in terms of our legal framework is just not conducive or congruent to the needs to work globally, tackling this issue. So if they have to avoid working with us in terms of collaborating, i.e. on an arrest such like this, in the best interest of their own national security issues and own public safety issues, it's sometimes best to sidestep the Canadians, not because of the Canadian police, but the legal system, particularly the Stinchcombe cases and the Jordan cases relative to disclosure that make it very difficult for our foreign partners to work with us, but make it very, very appealing for some of these players with a lot of ties back to Canada, like the individual you just mentioned, find it somewhat appealing to live and operate here, sadly. But Nick, you mentioned something that I really wanted to ask today, and probably one of the most important questions, and it's something that really I think is really important because some of the audience that we have is police. That I policed for 33 years, and there was a culture of us versus them with investigative journalists historically. And it wasn't until my later career that I realized, perhaps there's a collaborative way to work with journalists that didn't compromise security issues or sensitive information by supporting them in terms of open source material, by sharing how these groups work so they can highlight some of these. And I think that's really important for police to understand, maybe from your perspective, in terms of how they can kind of have that safe community outreach with journalists and the value that you think it brings, respecting the timeline that we have.
I mean, unfortunately, Calvin, cops often only understand the merit of the media once they retire, and then they say, "Oh, it's quite a useful tool at times." Institutions, policing institutions, intelligence agencies, these institutions are always wary of the press. They want to. Information is power. You want to control the information. You don't want it to come out. I absolutely understand that rationale, but there is a huge benefit when you have officials working behind the scenes or not, or even publicly with journalists to get out significant issues of that are in the public interest. It doesn't happen often enough. Certainly not in Australia. I mean, the US actually has a really interesting culture where there is, and I think it's the whole freedom of the press and sort of historical constitutional vein that partly promotes it. But officials give, I mean, for instance, the State Department or the Intel and policing agency have these sessions where they call in journos, and it's sort of off the record, but it's formal. There's intensive, lengthy briefings about matters of significant national security interest, and then it's in the New York Times the next day. We don't really have that in Australia. There's a real sort of guarded culture about information. It's perhaps a Commonwealth thing. Our agencies see themselves as very proper, and they see the media as very not proper. We shouldn't sort of get in the gutter with journalists. And what's left? Well, people like me end up building ties as best you can across the agencies in an informal sense. But it's a horrible way to do business because you've got to conduct yourself on encrypted applications and meet people in parks and always worried about your friend who's an official, your source losing their job if they're caught talking to you. You've got a very paranoid and hyper surveillance conscious. And for what? For doing your job to inform the public about something that the public should know about, the police force wants out, the intel agency wants out, and ultimately, when it's out, informs really good public debate and political change. So I'm all for getting policing agencies and officials to work with journalists and to any of your police listeners. Build a relationship of trust with the local reporter in time. Obviously you've got to test the waters, but once you get that relationship of trust, you can use the reporter to great effect and often the reporter's interests will be overlapping with your interests, and it'll help expose a policing area of concern that you want a government to resource or to legislate. Take a risk and do it, and it's all about informing that public debate and making the world a better place.
I'll just say, the famous saying is, when your enemy is my enemy, that makes us friends. And I think as we're going forward on these type of issues with, transnational organized crime and these threats, that's super important for police to recognize, the value that you bring to the table, and other journalists do it. So I thank you. And I know Nathan's going to wrap up here. So thanks very much for joining us, and over to Nathan.
Yeah, and thanks, Nick, for taking the time to come on today. I just want to give you a chance to say how people can follow you or find your work. Where's the best places to see what you're doing?
I think just a good old Google if you're interested. But yeah, there's. I mean, my audience is mostly in Australia, but I'm on Twitter and elsewhere. But if you're interested, you can just simply Google my name and see the work that's coming out. But there's lots of journalists doing some great work in Australia and elsewhere. And the great thing is this global community we live in. I can access information about China's organised crime in Canada and its overlap with the CCP, and it's links into the West in Australia with the click of a button. And that's an exciting time to live in when that's the case. So thanks for having me, guys. All the best.
Okay, take care. Thank you very much.